We have today, through the support of BookNet Canada, two folks who are going to be providing ASL interpretation during this call. You should see them pinned on the upper left along with Graham. You don't have to do anything specific, but it's a good way to follow on if you are hearing impaired and could use assistance during this webinar. I'd like to thank Graham Bell, who's Executive Director of EDItEUR, for making the time and preparing a presentation today on the EU Deforestation Regulations, or EUDR and ONIX. Graham has been working diligently over the last year to try and better understand the requirements and also to build in a capacity within ONIX to meet some of those requirements. And he's here today to talk about both the regulations and how ONIX can support them. Graham, over to you.
Thank you, Brian. It's a hard day to do this because of Noah, but let's go on with it. So this presentation is about the European Union's new-ish deforestation regulations. I want to introduce you to the regulations, who they apply to, some of the requirements that they place upon publishers and others in the supply chain, and also introduce you to one of the ways that you might be able to make it a little easier to work with. So I'm hoping, first of all, that you can all see my slides, and if not, put something in the chat, or yeah, that should do it, and then somebody will pick it up. And I want to introduce you to our organization, EDItEUR. So EDItEUR, first of all, is a not-for-profit organization. We're financially supported by members, just like BISG and indeed BookNet Canada. What we do is that we develop technical standards for metadata, for identification. We support those standards, we promote those standards, because once we've created them, we want them to be used. And those standards are for the book supply chain. And by the book supply chain, I include ebooks, I include audiobooks, digital audio as well. And by that supply chain, I also mean that supply chain globally. Our standards are used not just in Britain, where EDItEUR is based, and in North America, but also a little less in other parts of the world. So in Latin America, there are organizations that use our standards in South Africa, throughout Europe, and in Japan and Australia, and even China and Korea. So we really do mean global standards for communication about books. As I said, we're based in the United Kingdom, in London, but our membership, those who support us and use our standards most, are based all over the world, and they sit all the way along the supply chain. So we have publishers in membership, we have distribution organizations and retailers and libraries, rights organizations and system vendors. They all form part of our membership. And that gives us a somewhat privileged position, because we consult with those members, we talk to those members all the time. We begin to understand some of their problems, and we try to make our standards help them. The more that our standards get used, the more that they can help our membership and help everybody else, the better it is for us. And the other thing that we do that's unusual is that we make all of our standards free of charge. So everybody can use ONIX, everybody can use Thema, without paying anything to EDItEUR. That's important for us because we believe that these standards should be very widely used. We don't want to place barriers in front of anybody who wants to use them. So we develop a range of standards. We also do a few other things. We provide management services to other standards organizations. So it used to be a few years ago that the International ISBN Agency was based in our office. And these days, they have their own office now, and it's a separate organization. These days, we provide similar sorts of services to ISNI, that's the International Standard Name Identifier, and to the DOI Foundation. So we're very closely linked to that world of standards, and particularly metadata and identification standards for our industry. That's why we're talking about this. And we're talking specifically about the European Union's regulations on deforestation-free products. Now, these are a new range of regulations. And I say new, but they actually passed into law just over a year ago in mid-2023. And when they passed into law, the people affected were given 18 months to prepare for implementation. That's now down to 4 months. So these regulations are very proximate. They will begin to affect you from the end of this year. And so this presentation is about preparing. What are the regulations for? Well, they aim to limit deforestation or forest degradation. That's linked to a loss of biodiversity and so on. And so the regulations mandate deforestation-free products, products that don't rely on raw materials that come from areas that have been recently deforested. By recently there, I kind of mean since the acts came into force. So if an area was deforested in 2021 or 2022, the timber from that is not covered by these regulations. But if the trees were cut down after June of 2023, then the timber and all derived products are covered by these regulations. And this really comes out of the EU's drive towards sustainability and transparency within the supply chain. EU consumers are big consumers of commodities like wood, like cocoa, like soybeans and palm oil and coffee and rubber. And these raw materials are often grown in areas that have been very recently deforested. So the area of deforested land keeps increasing in order to fulfill the demand and drive for these raw materials. So the EU is saying there's nothing wrong with these products so long as they come from land that has not been recently deforested. The regulations aim to limit Europeans' future contribution to the problems of deforestation and loss of biodiversity. So the rules came into force, in fact, just over a year ago, but they only start being active at the end of this year, at the end of December 2024. The rules put a lot of emphasis on record keeping. Where did the tree come from? And of course, the trees are important because those form the raw material for our books, the paper. So the aim of the regulations is to be able to say, for this particular book, where did the trees grow? And did those trees, or were those trees grown on deforested land? Were they an old forest that was cut down? Is it contributing to a loss of biodiversity? Now, I should say that June 2023 date is important for these regulations, but in fact, before that, there were earlier regulations called the EU Timber Regulations that have been in place for significantly more than a decade. So there's nothing particularly new about this. It's just a bit extended from those EU timber regulations. So what do the regulations actually say? Well, they require that anybody in the supply chain could be an operator in the supply chain or a trader in the supply chain, and I'll come back to what those mean. Anybody, an operator or a trader who places products on the market in the EU, and those products are derived from those commodities like wood and cocoa and, well, leather from cattle and soybeans and palm oil. Anything that's made from those raw materials needs to be able to prove, for the operators and traders, need to be able to prove that those products came from land that was not recently deforested or degraded. So the record keeping, operators and to some extent traders have to collect and retain data that allows you to trace a book, or specifically the paper in a book, back to a specific plot of land. This paper, this book was made from timber that was harvested from this forest. Now, not all forests are the same. Some forests, some plots of land come from relatively low risk countries where the timber trade is well managed and sustainable. And other trees come from forests that are in high risk countries. Countries where the illegal logging is prevalent or where the forests are not well managed. And so operators in particular don't just have to be able to trace the tree back to the forest, but also have to do a risk assessment. How likely is it that this forest caused deforestation? And potentially they also need to take steps to mitigate the risk of deforestation having occurred. So that's the aim. It's about traceability of those raw materials. And it doesn't just apply to wood and paper, it applies to a range of raw materials. How does this actually work? Well, the EU has created an online portal. They call it the Deforestation Registry. And those operators, those traders, will need to upload into the online portal information about the provenance of raw materials. So if you, as an operator or a trader, are handling a particular book, you need to know what kind of paper it is, who made that paper. You need to be able to trace it back to the pulp, to the tree, to the forest. And that's what that registry collects, information about where the raw materials came from. And each operator, and possibly traders, need to create a due diligence statement. That is, within the portal, provide all the information about those raw materials. And all that information together comprises a due diligence statement, sometimes a DDS. An important thing to realize is that, of course, books are made from several different types of paper. There may be a plate section on higher quality coated paper. There's the paper or fiberboard that goes into the cover and the jacket. It's not just the pages of the main body of the book. And for a product to be compliant with the regulations, all of those different types of paper and fiberboard need to comply with the regulations individually. So it's not just one kind of paper, it's everything that goes into the product. And of course, this raises a number of questions. The first one, obviously, is, well, surely this doesn't apply to me. And particularly inside North America, certain parts of Europe that are not part of the EU, it's a perfectly good question to ask. This doesn't apply to me. Well, unfortunately, it does. Unless three things. You have to be based outside the European Economic Area. That's actually slightly bigger than the European Union. It's 30 countries instead of 27. So you need to be outside the European Economic Area. Your books need to be manufactured outside the EEA. The paper needs to be made outside the EEA, and the books cannot be for sale inside the EEA. So if those three things apply, you don't need to worry about the deforestation regulations. You have to be based outside the EU. Your books have to be made outside the EU, and they can't be sold inside the EU. If that's true, you don't need to worry. But if one or more of those is not true, let's say you're an American or Canadian publisher, but you're selling your books into the EU, then it does apply. And it applies from the 30th of December this year, roughly 4 months' time. Now, there's little leeway. If you are a small or medium-sized organization, then you actually have another 6 months. So that goes to the end of June next year. But by small and medium enterprise, the European Union means you have to have at least 2 of these 3 things. Less than 20 million euros, so that's about $22 million on the balance sheet. It's rather more in Canadian dollars. Your turnover needs to be less than about 44 million US dollars, and you have to have less than 250 staff. Fewer staff than that, no problem. But you need to have 2 of those, not just 1 of them. So it's either going to apply to you quite soon, end of this year, or quite soon, middle of next year. And you need to prepare for it in advance. The other obvious question is, well, do I have to do the due diligence statement? Do I have to upload all of the data about the raw materials to the EU's online portal? And the answer is, well, somebody has to do it, and it may well be you. It somewhat depends on whether you're an operator or a trader. Now, traders don't have to create those due diligence statements, but they do have to refer back to them. So if an operator creates a due diligence statement, a trader needs to be able to say, here is the reference to the due diligence statement created by somebody else. Traders can refer back to previous DDSs. Although legally, the responsibility for making sure the product is in compliance with the regulations applies to everybody in the supply chain. And obviously you might say, well, do I do this just once? No, you don't. The regulations apply at product level. Each ISBN is separate. Each ISBN will have to have a due diligence statement. There's a few little get-outs though. If your products use only recycled paper and recycled fiberboard, then those products are excluded from the regulations. But if it's partly recycled, it is included, and you have to account for the non-recycled raw materials. You can ignore recycled raw materials. So the big question that everybody wants to ask is, so am I an operator or am I a trader? Because it's harder for operators. And answering that question is a bit tricky. I should say at this point, I'm not a lawyer. I cannot provide you with legal advice. Tiny bit of guidance, but definitely not legal advice. In most cases, publishers will be operators and they'll be responsible for creating due diligence statements. In many cases, paper mills and printers will also be operators. In a few cases, anybody who's responsible for importing books into the EU may also be an operator. Small retailers will likely just be traders. A few big retailers may count as operators, particularly if they import books off their own bat, rather than trying to buy books from distributors inside the EU. So some big retailers will be having to comply with these regulations too. And the only bit of semi-legal advice I can give is talk to your lawyers. Everybody in the supply chain should seek competent legal advice on responsibilities under these regulations. Now, some of these regulations have a metadata aspect. I've already said that due diligence statements created by operators, well, traders can refer back to them. So operators need to provide traders with a sort of document reference that they can use to refer back to DDSs. And in some cases, people further down the supply chain are not going to want just those document references, but also provenance data. Where exactly did this tree grow? So DDS and provenance data needs to be passed along the supply chain. So each party knows with good confidence, where did this tree grow? Because some of them at least will have to prove that's where the tree grew. Now, we create a standard called ONIX, as almost everybody on the call will know. It's not generally used by paper mills, by printers. So these organizations who will have to pass, at minimum, due diligence statement document references to the publisher. But in most cases, they'll have to pass richer data to the publisher as well, because the publisher is going to have to do a DDS. But we can't help them in ONIX because the paper mills and the printers don't really use ONIX. But as soon as the data gets to a publisher, we can probably help people pass the relevant data along. You can use ONIX right now to pass details of raw materials from operators to traders, maybe also to other operators that are downstream in the supply chain. So this is already a part of ONIX. Although I would say, you're buying a third-party system to create your ONIX, this is probably not enabled yet. It's only a month or so since we announced it. Apologies if you're not so technical. Some people I know on this call are not familiar with the details of ONIX, and that's fine. But for those of you who are, this is how you can communicate a DDS reference, a due diligence statement reference. It goes into product form feature. It uses a product form feature type 50. And that means that the product form feature value is one of those due diligence statement references. And they all have the look of that number or that alphanumeric 24FRXVB3, that one. I think the 24 means that the due diligence statement was created this year, and the FR means, I think, that the due diligence statement was created somewhere by somebody based in France. But we can't really guarantee the nature of that number. But one way or another, that number identifies a due diligence statement record inside the registry. I think almost everybody in the supply chain, either in Europe or supplying books to Europe, will have to do this and deliver a DDS document reference. Almost everybody. And that's the best picture I can find of the due diligence portal that the EU has set up. It's still being tweaked, and a few people testing it. But you put all your details about the raw materials into the portal. It gives you a document reference, and then you tell other people about the document reference. Going a little further than that, some people in the supply chain will need to know where the trees grew. And this is done in this way. There's a code there, 48. That is the provenance of the raw materials, in this case for a cover. It could be 47 if it's the body of a book. It could be 49 if it's some other part like outer packaging or a supplement or something like that. But codes 47, 48, 49 refer to provenance. Where did the trees grow? And then at the bottom, we have a GPS coordinate. GPS coordinates made up of 2 decimal numbers. So we've got latitude and longitude in that order. And these can vary. Latitude can vary from +90 to -90. If it's a negative number, it's south of the equator. If it's a positive number, it's north of the equator. And the longitude, the second number, that can vary from 180 to -180. If it's a positive number like this one, it means it's to the east of the Greenwich Meridian, so East London and much further. And if it's a negative number, it's to the west of the Greenwich Meridian. So if the trees grew in Canada, then they'll both be positive numbers.
Yeah.
Now you'd think that that would be the location of a tree, because a GPS coordinate with 6 decimal digits, that gives you a precision of about that much, of about 10 centimeters, 4 inches. You can get things down to the nearest 4 inches, 10 centimeters for the Canadians. And actually, it seems a bit overkill to me, that level of precision, but there you go. That's what the EU demands. So you'd think that you can narrow it down to a tree. In fact, not. That GPS coordinate is a point in the middle of a small forest. And the forest needs to be 4 hectares or less. I think that's about 6 to 8 football fields, not the stadiums, just the main part of the football field. And so if it's a 4 hectare or less plot, that'll be about 10 acres. If your forest is that small, then you can nominate that forest with 1 single GPS coordinate. Of course, many forests are much larger than that. So if you have a larger forest, this is how you say the trees came from this forest. And in this case, we're using code 47. It's the raw material for the body of the book. And we're using a list of GPS coordinates. There's actually 4 GPS coordinates there, separated by commas. And these relate to a forest, but it's a forest and you draw around it. Instead of nominating 1 point in the middle of the forest, you draw what's called a polygon around the forest. In this case, red, green, and blue points, and then red again, because we want it to be a closed triangle. So we've now drawn a line, a polygon, around the forest using, in this case, 4 GPS points. And what the ONIX is saying is that the trees were taken from this forest. So a polygon, key term, and what we have in product form feature description is 1 polygon, defined by 3 points, and then the first point is repeated so that it's a closed polygon. And good practice tip, draw your polygons clockwise. So make sure they're closed by repeating the first point again and draw them clockwise. So there we have points and polygons. There's actually an intermediate option as well, but points and polygons are where you are. Points for very small forests. Polygons can be almost any size, although the polygon can't cover more than 1 country. Also can't cross the international date line at 180 degrees longitude. Now we're looking also at adding a little bit more flexibility to this. What you've already seen is already in ONIX. It was added a couple of months ago. we're looking at a couple of possible future additions that might make it a bit easier. Because these polygons, you might have lots of them. You might have paper that's made from wood that came from this forest and that forest and another forest, and then a little bit from some other forest. So you're going to get lots of polygons. So we've been looking at a couple of potential future additions. One relates to something I haven't told you yet, product form feature value. Now, normally that consists of two things: the country the polygon is in, and that relates back to countries that are high risk or low risk, and a date when the trees were cut down and harvested. And so the date of harvest is important because if your trees were cut down in 2022 or 2021, they're not subject to these regulations. So we need to know when the tree was cut down. And that's what we already have. But we're also looking at an option to add what kind of tree it was. The species of tree. In this case, I think that's white spruce, which grows a lot of Canada and about half the US. It's a very common spruce, very commonly used in paper manufacture. If it's grown in Europe, then it's probably not Picea glauca, it's probably Picea abes, which is the more common spruce in Europe. It has to be the Latin name, the so-called binomial name. The other extension we're looking at is to compress lots of polygons into one. So we have here a list of 1, 2, 3, 4 points, which will define a triangular forest. But we also think that you might want to combine forests together, not just that one triangular forest, but also that square one as well. And so we can add that into the ONIX. The forests are separated by semicolons, and that square forest is represented by 5 GPS coordinates, 4, and then the first one is repeated again. That's the way of combining those GPS polygons. Now, what you see on this slide is not part of ONIX yet. We're going to propose it in a month or so. Now, each type of paper, each type of card or board is going to have a provenance. In fact, at least one provenance, because most papers, most cardstocks, most types of board will be made from pulp that comes from multiple forests and multiple species of tree. So there's almost certainly going to be lots of product form feature repeats within your ONIX. We enable this by adding something to list 79. As I mentioned before, code list 47, 48, 49 are those provenance for the body of the book, provenance for the cover and the binding, and 49 for an other. Hardcover, a typical hardcover book is going to need information about the main body paper, maybe a plate section, an insert. The boards of the cover, the different paper that you use for end papers, the jacket of a hardback. Each of these will be a different type of paper in most cases. There'll also be, if you put faux linen on your hardbacks, that faux linen is almost certainly a paper product as well, which you will need to list. Now, there's one level of uncertainty. But I think also if your book happens to be leather bound, now leather is a byproduct of raising cattle, and cattle was one of those commodities that I listed at the beginning. And so leather bindings might also need a provenance. Where was the field in which those cattle, fields in which those cattle grazed? Now, it'll only apply to leather that comes from cows, from cattle. If you're using goat skin or sheep skin or eel skin doesn't actually come from eels. Or if it's bonded leather, which is reformed from waste leather, kind of counts as recycled, then you don't need to worry. But if you've got leather bindings that come from cattle, then potentially you need to provide provenances for that too. And I know this all sounds a bit complex, but it's going to get slightly more complex. It's a feature of our industry that we do multiple impressions of a particular book. And it's quite possible that each different impression uses different grades of paper. Same product, but different grade of paper, or maybe similar grade, but comes from a different manufacturer. And it will have a different set of provenances. If the paper is different, it's going to come from a different forest. Now, we could treat each impression as a distinct product. I don't think that's how it's going to happen because, well, first of all, we don't have an identifier that works right down to impression level. Secondly, that's not how the portal works. And thirdly, it's just going to be too much work. I think the other reason is that if you're doing each impression separately, you would need to do lots of metadata updates. Every time there's a new impression, you'd need to do a new update. And that still wouldn't work for two reasons. The first reason it wouldn't work is that when a bookseller or a consumer orders a copy of a book, they don't know which impression they're going to get. They could get the latest copy fresh off the press into the warehouse and then back out again. Or they could get a copy that is in fact a return. It's the impression that was printed 9 months ago, bought by somebody, returned back to the warehouse, and then sold again. So there's no guarantee that you're going to get a particular impression. So linking all the provenances of where the trees came from to impression numbers is not going to help because a retailer doesn't know which impression they're going to get. And that's because the distributors and wholesalers in their warehouses don't offer what's called lot control. They don't keep copies of the third impression and copies of the fourth impression separate. They just fulfill whatever's most convenient, what's at the front of the shelf. And they also use returns to fulfill new orders. So you can't really predict what impression a consumer is going to get. And so having metadata about each impression separately is either not going to work or it's going to be wildly complicated. There is a potential solution. And that is, instead of having a list of provenances for the specific third impression, which will be different from the provenances of the second impression, build a cumulative list. So if your second impression used this paper and your third impression used a different paper, yes, you're going to have to update the DDS. Yes, you're going to have to update the provenance in your ONIX, but instead of managing it, you just add new provenances. You don't need to get rid of the old ones. So yes, each additional impression with different paper will require a post-publication update, but that post-publication update is relatively simple. And it looks like this. Here we've got information, let's say, about, well, this applies to the first and second impressions. We've used some paper that came from the triangular forest. We've used some board, maybe for the cover, or card for the cover, that came from a very small forest. And here's at the bottom, our due diligence statement document reference. And then the third impression comes along, and for this, you're using a different interior paper. So you just add it. So now we have two papers, or two sets of two separate forests. Could be two lists of forests, one of which applies to the first impression, one of which applies to the second. sorry, to the third. But whichever copy a retailer gets, it will be from one of these two. There's no requirement that your book in the third impression uses raw materials from all of the forests, only that all of the raw materials come from at least one of the forests. So building a cumulative list of provenances seems like the only practical way to go for our industry. There are a few other considerations. I'm nearly at the end now. First of all, do you use FSC accredited paper? The Forest Stewardship Council gives publishers a badge for each product if the publisher can guarantee that the paper comes from well-managed forests. The Forest Stewardship Council has been running this for, well, years, more than a decade. And many books carry the FSC accredited logo. Now, in North America, you also get PEFC and a couple of other schemes that do very similar things. Guarantee that the paper comes from sustainably managed forests. Now, I call out FSC because last month they launched an extra requirement. Think of it as a kind of FSC plus badge, which brings their accreditation into alignment with the requirements of the European Union Deforestation Regulations. They also have, FSC has a handy new risk assessment framework that can be used if you know your paper is coming from one of those high-risk countries. So it allows you to estimate the risk that your paper comes from a plot of land that's been recently deforested, and pointers to mitigation of that risk. So take a look at those FSC regulatory modules that have been recently added. Secondly, print on demand, POD, is a bit of a problem because the paper type used in POD is not directly known to the publisher. It might not even be known until the customer order is placed, and then the POD printer chooses what paper to put it on. So there will have to be a way for manufacturers to pass details to POD companies, and then the POD companies will have to pass those details back to publishers and retailers. We've not fully worked that out yet. So when does the registry become available? Well, it looks like mid-December. The EU is creating user instructions and they should be available this month. There's some training arranged for next month, user registration in November, and the go live date for the registry is in mid-December. Cutting it fine to my point of view, but that's what they say. Last couple of slides are just some further details. Under the EU heading, we've got references to the actual text of the regulations, to information about how the registry works, and reports on transparency and so on. Under CPI, CPI is a printer, and they've produced actually one of the better guides I've seen to this. So if you want to look at or think about or discuss these regulations from the point of view of a printer, then that's a good document to download. Last on this slide, reference to that FSC Plus accreditation with the new legal module in there. And links to some of our documentation, the actual main ONIX documentation, the control vocabularies or code lists. There's a couple of mailing lists. The ONIX mailing list is quite technical. It's a good place to ask technical questions. We also have the News from EDItEUR mailing list, which is much more general and is kind of a one-way distribution of our news. Whilst we're talking about EU regulation, EUDR is not the only thing you need to be worried about. There's a GPSR, the General Product Safety Regulations. They also have a deadline of, I think, the 29th of December in that particular case. And they extend what used to be called the EU Toy Safety Regulations. So they apply to all products, books on the whole particularly safe, unless it's a kind of books plus product, where the plus might be a little toy or some coloring pens or whatever else gets bundled with your book. And there are particular safety requirements if you do that sort of product. GPSR has one requirement that pretty much everybody will need to comply with, and that is for products safe, no matter what your product is, whether you think it's safe or not, you will need to supply in the metadata a contact for queries about safety and liability. And that contact can go into the ONIX using product contact or supply contact. It needs to be a contact inside the EU, and you need to give not only a name, department, company, but also a postal address, not just an email address. Relatively simple to do. And then European Accessibility Act has a deadline at the end of June 25. So we've got about 8 months to go. EAA applies to digital products. Everything else I've talked about today is physical. But the EAA applies to digital products, and you need to optimize the accessibility of your products to make sure they can be read by people who perhaps can't use the sense of sight to read. They maybe have to use the sense of hearing or something like that. So EAA for accessibility. And there's about 8 months to go. Part of EAA also means delivering information about accessibility in your metadata. And for those of you who are stuck through this but remain completely baffled, if you're completely unfamiliar with ONIX, if you want to find out a little bit about ONIX, there's a URL there that points to a short briefing video, just 15 minutes, that will give you more of an insight into just what ONIX is. Thank you. Just as a reminder, nothing I've said here can be construed as legal advice.
It might not be legal advice, but it's terrifying all the same.
Chris reminded me a few months ago, he's sitting opposite, to remember that the American Forest Act, which is sort of half-heartedly going through Congress at the moment, actually gets at many of the same things that the EUDR, not all of them, it doesn't demand provenances, but it gets at many of the same issues that EUDR gets at. It's not just a European thing.
Hey, Graham, it seems to me like with this cumulative approach, that one thing a publisher might do is get all of this information, essentially build a database of all of the different forests that are used across their entire range of publications, and then send essentially a database with
one
every single
massive list that covers all of their products.
Yeah.
Yes, I thought about that as well. It seems a little bit against the tone of EUDR. I cannot say whether that would be acceptable to the EU or not. I think cumulative across a product, almost certain to be okay, particularly given the nature of our supply chain. Cumulative across a publisher's entire range of products, don't know. It's one of those things that you'd have to take legal advice on.
Well, the other thing that I'm thinking is right now, I know that we have difficulty with maintaining even paper type and paper grade for each product that we do. But it seems that what we're going to have to do is add those attributes into the product master and make sure that they're mandatory and kept up to date.
I think you have it exactly right, Ken. I think I said right at the outset that this is about record keeping. And the EU is demanding much better records are kept. In the same way that the processed meat industry will have to keep records of exactly where your steak came from. Mostly already do that in Europe, in fact, tracing cows back to farms. People selling cocoa will have to do that. People selling palm oil will have to do that. And the high-risk countries will be under the microscope. Sorry, I was just going to say it's all about record keeping.
Yeah. So one of the questions was, what about titles that are already in the market? So we've got an ISBN that's, a year old.
Yeah.
Predates the regulations. What do you do?
So first of all, if you printed all of the copies before 2023, then you're fine. If you've printed new impressions since then, the products will be covered. There's no reference to the publication date or anything like that. It's putting products on the market, which everybody seems to be interpreting as putting copies of that product, not when you first launched that product, but when you put that copy on the market.
How would they even know? Is this like going to be an import regulation, or
well,
yeah?
Bear in mind, there won't be just one due diligence statement. The publisher will, in most cases, create a due diligence statement to say, when this copy was created, or where the provenance of the raw materials came from. But paper manufacturers and printers will also be doing the same. And so there'll be cross-checks. The printer knows exactly which product they're printing, and they know where did the paper come from. And so all of these things will be shared. That's why there's a single point where all the data needs to be collected, and that's the EU's registry. It will become, I think, gradually more difficult to just say, oh, this paper was made before June 2023.
Well, I'm thinking about...
And of course, this is going to be auditable.
Yeah, I'm thinking about multiple printers in multiple parts of the world printing the same ISBN.
Due diligence references will have to be delivered when you import things into the EU.
And the UK is not part of this, or is it?
Oh, that's a tricky one, Ken. So the regulations, as far as we can work out, apply to the EEA, the European Economic Area. So that's the 27 countries of the European Union, plus Norway, Liechtenstein, and possibly Iceland. Britain is not part of the European Union, and also not part of the extra extended bit that forms the European Economic Area. We're outside of both. And yet, there is a little bit of the United Kingdom, specifically Northern Ireland, that is kind of half inside the EEA, the European Economic Area. So in general, you're right. Great Britain is not part of these regulations. Actually, a tiny part of Britain is Northern Ireland. And also, all publishers in the UK depend on European sales of their books.
Yeah.
So this applies to us just as much, if not more than it applies to North American publishers.
We're about out of time here. There have been a ton of questions in chat that I think we'd like to see if we could capture and maybe figure out how we can get them addressed. I want to thank you again for presenting a thoroughly terrifying view of regulations that are about to become relevant to everyone. So very well presented. I know I'm not going to sleep well tonight thinking about this, but thank you anyway.
It's my pleasure. I will, if somebody sends me the chat log, I will go through the questions. I can see they're still coming in, and I can see also some of them have already been answered, but I'll go through them and find a way to provide at least some of the main answers to the audience. Thank you all very much for listening.
Graham, really appreciate
And
it.
Ken,
Thank you.
and Ken,
Thank
to your
you very
point,
much.
we will come back to this topic this fall and continue to discuss it. We thought it would be good to start with Graham's overview because he's given quite a bit of thought to how the structure of ONIX can be used to meet at least some of the requirements of the new regulations.
That was at least one lifeline. Thank you, Graham, for that.
Thank you. And thank you again to BookNet Canada for being kind enough to bring us ASL interpreting resources for this webinar. Really much appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks, Graham.
Great seeing everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.